In September of 1991, a German couple hiking off the Mark Trail in the Ötztal Alps, along the border between Austria and Italy, spotted something brownish poking out of the meltwater at the edge of a shrinking glacier. Their first assumption was the obvious one. A modern climber, unlucky, lost to the mountain in recent years. It took several days of clumsy recovery work, and more than a little accidental damage from ice picks and curious onlookers, before anyone realized what they were actually looking at. The tools scattered near the body weren't nylon and aluminum. They were copper, flint, and wood. The man in the ice hadn't been there for a season or a decade. He'd been there for roughly 5,000 years, held almost perfectly by the cold, older than the pyramids of Giza, walking those slopes while Stonehenge was still an idea in someone's head. That discovery became Ötzi the Iceman, and for the past 3 decades he has been, by a wide margin, the most thoroughly studied ancient human being on the planet. He has been X-rayed, CT scanned, endoscoped, biopsied, and sequenced. Scientists know what he ate in his last 2 meals. They know he had whipworm eggs in his intestines and hardened arteries in his chest. They know he was lactose intolerant like most people of his era, and that he carried a strain of a stomach bacterium still found in people today. And for a long time, they thought they knew what he looked like, and roughly where his ancestors came from. Recent, more rigorous genetic work has shown that a good part of that picture was wrong, not because anyone lied, but because the science of an earlier decade could only see so far, and because of a problem that has quietly plagued ancient DNA research since it began: contamination. To understand why the correction mattered so much, it helps to remember just how much the ice actually preserved. This wasn't a skeleton pulled from a peat bog or a burial mound. The glacier had kept Ötzi's skin, his internal organs, his stomach contents, and his tattoos. More than 60 of them, small dark lines etched into his lower back, his knees, and his ankles, positioned, researchers later noticed, directly over joints where he had developed arthritis and worn cartilage. It's widely thought these marks weren't decorative in the way we usually think of tattoos, but a kind of ancient pain treatment, ink applied to the places that hurt. His clothing survived too: a coat stitched from the hides of several different animals, leggings, a bearskin cap, and shoes insulated with grass for warmth. So did his equipment: an unfinished longbow, a quiver of arrows, birch bark containers, and an axe with a blade made almost entirely of copper, a rare and valuable object for its time that suggested he wasn't just some anonymous traveler but a man of at least modest standing in his community. Every object told part of a story. He wasn't a specimen in the way a fossil is a specimen. He was a person caught mid-journey, frozen at the exact moment his ordinary Copper Age day went badly wrong. And it did go wrong, though it took researchers years to fully understand how. The earliest assumption was that Ötzi had simply been caught in a storm and died of exposure. A fairly peaceful, if grim, end. That assumption held for roughly a decade, until a radiologist reviewing his CT scans noticed something small and dense lodged just under his left shoulder blade. A flint arrowhead, driven in from behind, tearing a major blood vessel near his collarbone. Ötzi hadn't lain down and frozen. He had been shot, and had very likely bled out on that ridge, alone, within a fairly short window of time. Later analysis added more detail to the scene: a deep, partially healed cut on his right hand, consistent with defending himself in a close encounter a day or 2 before he died, and blood from at least 4 different people found on his gear, on his knife, his cloak, and the shafts of his arrows. What emerged wasn't a picture of a man lost in bad weather. It was a picture of a man being pursued, fighting, and finally killed from a distance by someone who came up the mountain after him. And strikingly, whoever killed him didn't take the copper axe lying beside the body, an object valuable enough, by the standards of his time, that leaving it behind was itself a kind of statement. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It looks, by most reasonable readings of the evidence, personal. All of that came from the body itself, the wound patterns, the blood typing, the tool marks. The genetics took longer, and for good reason. The moment any organism dies, its DNA begins to break down. Long, orderly strands fragmenting into shorter and shorter pieces over time, mixing with the DNA of bacteria, fungi, and anyone who has ever touched the remains. After a few thousand years, What's left isn't a readable book anymore. It's confetti, a chaotic mix of tiny torn scraps that early genetic tools simply couldn't reassemble. For most of the history of ancient DNA research, sequencing something this old, this degraded, and this handled, Ötzi's body had thawed, refrozen, and been chipped at with ice tools before anyone grasped what they were dealing with, seemed close to impossible. The first genetic work on him, carried out in the 1990s and early 2000s, could only reach one small, unusually durable piece of his genome. His mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line passed largely unchanged from mother to child across generations. That early read suggested his maternal lineage fit reasonably well within the range of ancient European populations. It seemed to confirm what everyone already assumed. But it was a keyhole view of an enormous locked room, and it came with an odd wrinkle that got relatively little attention at the time. When researchers looked for living relatives who shared that same maternal lineage, they found almost none. It appeared to be an unusually rare branch, one that may have simply thinned out and nearly vanished from the modern gene pool over the following 5 millennia. The real breakthrough came in 2012, when a team working with the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, where Ötzi's body is kept to this day in a specially built chamber held at glacier-like temperatures, drilled a tiny sample from his hip bone. From that sliver, using a new generation of sequencing technology capable of reading millions of DNA fragments in parallel and computationally stitching them back together, researchers produced the first full genome ever generated from remains that old and that well preserved. It was, at the time, a genuine landmark in the field. That genome told them his blood type. It confirmed his lactose intolerance. It flagged a genetic predisposition toward hardened arteries, meaning he may well have been at risk of a cardiac event even without the arrow. And it placed his ancestry broadly within the range of populations then living in Copper Age Europe, a mix that, based on the tools and reference data available at the time, appeared to include some contribution from the steppe herder populations who would later sweep in from the east and reshape much of the continent's genetics. That 2012 genome was a milestone, but it wasn't the final word, because the field kept moving. Sequencing technology kept improving. Reference databases, the vast, growing collections of DNA from both modern populations and hundreds of other ancient individuals excavated from sites stretching from Ireland to Central Asia, kept expanding year after year, giving researchers something they hadn't had in 2012, real context. A way to compare Ötzi not just to a handful of modern Europeans but to a detailed map of ancient population movement across the whole continent. So roughly a decade later, a team went back to the original samples with newer tools, stricter contamination filters, and a far larger comparative dataset, expecting mostly to sharpen an already known picture. Published in 2023, their reanalysis instead overturned two of the most repeated claims about Ötzi: his ancestry and his appearance. On ancestry, the correction was substantial. The earlier read had suggested a mixed profile that included some steppe ancestry, fitting Ötzi neatly into the broader wave of migration and genetic blending that was reshaping Copper Age Europe. The cleaned-up 2023 analysis found almost none of that. What had looked like steppe ancestry in the earlier data appears to have been largely an artifact of contamination. Modern DNA that had crept into the older, less rigorously filtered samples and subtly skewed the results toward a more typically European profile than was actually there. Once that contamination was stripped away, what remained was a genome overwhelmingly descended from the earliest farming populations who migrated out of Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, and spread across Europe thousands of years before Ötzi was born, and well before the steppe migrations that came later. More strikingly, Ötzi carried an unusually high proportion of that early farmer ancestry compared to other ancient individuals tested from similar regions and time periods, with little evidence of admixture with neighboring populations. The most straightforward explanation researchers have proposed is that his ancestors likely lived for generations in a relatively isolated alpine community, one that the broader genetic mixing sweeping across the rest of the continent simply hadn't reached to the same degree. The second correction concerned his appearance, and it's the one that changed the museum reconstructions people actually see when they visit Bolzano. For 30 years, artistic reconstructions of Ötzi gave him a full head of wavy dark hair and a thick beard, a rugged, approachable, unmistakably European face, the kind that made him feel relatable, almost familiar. The updated genetic analysis told a different story on both counts. The markers associated with hair growth pointed instead toward a strong genetic predisposition for male pattern baldness. By the time he died, somewhere in his mid-40s, which was a reasonably advanced age for someone in his time, he was quite likely balding, with a thinning, receding hairline rather than the flowing mane shown in earlier models. And the genetic markers associated with skin pigmentation pointed toward a skin tone considerably darker than the pale, sun-weathered complexion given to him in the original reconstructions. Among the darkest skin tones estimated for any European individual from that period whose genome has been analyzed this way. Taken together, the corrected picture is of a balding, dark-skinned man from a relatively isolated alpine farming community, a considerable departure from the pale, thick-haired mountaineer that had been sold to museum visitors and textbook readers for 3 decades. It's worth being precise about what these findings do and don't establish, because the researchers behind the 2023 study were themselves careful on this point. Estimating skin pigmentation from ancient DNA is a matter of statistical inference based on known genetic markers linked to pigmentation in living populations. It produces a well-supported estimate, not a photograph, and it comes with real uncertainty. The same is true of the ancestry percentages. They're drawn from comparison against a still-growing reference panel of ancient genomes, and refinements to that panel could sharpen or adjust the picture further as more ancient DNA from the region gets sequenced. But the direction of the correction was clear and consistent across the analysis. The earlier picture had leaned toward pale skin, a full head of hair, and a mixed ancestry that made Ötzi look like a fairly typical representative of the people who would come after him. The corrected picture pulls firmly in the other direction. Older, more genetically isolated, and physically quite different from what generations of museum visitors were shown. None of this happened because anyone set out to deceive the public. The early reconstructions were built in the 1990s, using the tools available at the time, the shape of his skull, the structure of his skeleton, and then filled in the considerable remaining gaps with the most familiar template the artists and researchers had on hand, which was, understandably, a modern European template. Nobody was trying to erase who Ötzi actually was. They simply didn't yet have the genetic tools to know, and where knowledge runs out, people tend to fill the space with something recognizable rather than something strange. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in reconstructions of ancient humans generally, not just Ötzi. Absent solid data, the past tends to get redrawn in the image of the present looking at it. What makes the correction land differently than a routine scientific update is what it does to the larger story people had built around Ötzi. For 30 years he functioned, in a loose cultural sense, as a kind of ancestral everyman for Europe, proof, supposedly, of a long, continuous, recognizably European lineage stretching back through the Alps to the dawn of metalworking. The corrected genome complicates that considerably. Ötzi's community appears to have been an unusually isolated pocket of very early farmer ancestry, holding on to a genetic profile that much of the rest of the continent had already begun mixing away from by his lifetime. Rather than a representative average ancient European, he looks more like a specific, somewhat unusual case. A man from one particular valley, with one particular and now quite rare lineage, who happened to die in a place where the ice would keep him intact enough to eventually tell his own story, 5,000 years later, over the heads of the people who thought they already knew it. That reframing also changes, a little, how the murder itself reads. Under the earlier ancestry model, Ötzi was one migrant among many in a continent that was actively churning with newcomers and genetic mixing, a plausible stranger passing through unfamiliar territory. Under the corrected model, he belonged to a small, closed, deeply rooted local population that had stayed largely in place while migration reshaped the regions around it. A tight-knit, insular community is also, almost by definition, a community where everyone knows who belongs and who doesn't, where a personal grudge doesn't easily dissolve into anonymity, and where a man carrying a valuable copper axe might attract exactly the kind of resentment that ends in an arrow to the back rather than a robbery. None of this can be proven from genetics alone, and the researchers involved have been careful not to overstate it. We will never know the specific dispute, if there was one, that sent someone up that mountain after him. But the corrected ancestry picture does make Ötzi read less like an anonymous traveler caught by chance, and more like a specific person, from a specific and identifiable community, killed by someone who quite plausibly knew him. The practical upshot of all this is already visible in Bolzano. The museum has begun updating its facial reconstructions to reflect the corrected genetic data. Darker skin, a receding hairline, a face closer to what the 2023 analysis actually supports rather than what earlier assumptions produced. It's a slow process, the kind of quiet correction that rarely makes as much noise as the original, flashier reconstruction did, but it matters. Millions of people have pressed their hands against that museum glass over the past 3 decades, looking at a face that turned out to be, in meaningful ways, more a reflection of mid-1990s assumptions about ancient Europeans than of the actual man in the ice. The corrected version won't be perfect either. Science is honest about its margins of error, and pigmentation and hair loss predictions from ancient DNA will keep being refined as the field matures, but it's a real step closer to the person who was actually found in that gully. There's also a broader lesson in how this unfolded, one that reaches well beyond a single frozen body in the Alps. Ancient DNA research is still a relatively young field, and contamination has been one of its most persistent and least glamorous problems. Not because anyone is being careless in an obvious way, but because separating a few surviving strands of 5,000-year-old genetic material from the DNA of everyone who has ever handled, stored, or studied that sample is genuinely difficult, and the tools for doing it cleanly have only become reliable relatively recently. Ötzi's case is a useful reminder that even a genome sequenced by serious, careful researchers using the best available methods at the time can still carry the fingerprints of the present tangled up with the past, and that later, more rigorous work can meaningfully change the picture. Not because the original scientists were sloppy, but because the field itself was still maturing. What makes Ötzi's story compelling, in the end, isn't really the specific shade of his skin or the state of his hairline, interesting as those details are. It's what the correction reveals about how confidently we can fill in gaps with assumption and have those assumptions harden, over 30 years of museum placards and textbook photographs, into something that felt like settled fact. Ötzi was photographed, scanned, biopsied, and sequenced more thoroughly than almost any human being who has ever lived, ancient or modern, and even he turned out to be, in important respects, misrepresented by the very field most invested in understanding him. That's not a story about deception. It's a story about the limits of early tools, the quiet pull toward the familiar when the evidence runs out, and what happens when better instruments finally let the evidence speak for itself. Ötzi died sometime in his mid-40s, on a mountain ridge, with an arrow wound under his shoulder blade, a partially healed defensive cut on his hand, blood from at least 4 other people on his gear, and his most valuable possession left untouched beside his body. He carried tattoos over his aching joints, evidence of an unusually pure and rare farming lineage from the earliest agricultural populations of Europe, and in all likelihood, darker skin and a balding scalp very unlike the bearded, ruddy-cheeked figure that greeted museum visitors for 3 decades. He wasn't a generic ancestor standing in for a continent's imagined past. He was one specific man, from one specific and now nearly vanished lineage, whose death on that glacier preserved him well enough that, 5,000 years later, better science could finally correct the story that had been told about him. Not by lying, but simply by finally being able to look closely enough to see him as he actually was.